Thanks, Raina. My name's Megan Williams. I'm a descendant of the Wiradjuri people, Central West New South Wales, from Mudgee specifically, on my father's side. And tonight I'm here to help acknowledge the Bidjigal people upon whose land this Kensington campus is built. We acknowledge the ancestors, generations now, and those who will come here in the future. We also acknowledge the Gadigal people on whose land the city area is. UNSW conducts a lot of business there too. We're on really significant sites here for the Bidjigal people, and this land's quite high up. It's got a view all the way around. It was a traditional meeting place, a traditional healing place, and a place of learning. Cultural objects really indicated these things when these buildings were in development. And nearby also are the very beginnings of colonisation in this country, Captain Cook's landing place at Kurnell and the Port Jackson settlement. Very regrettably, dispossession of traditional owners occurred right on these lands with violent deaths, diseases, forced relocation, loss of access to food and resources. So we carry those memories with us while we're here. But very importantly, it's not my position to actually welcome you here. I'm just doing an acknowledgement. It's the traditional owner's business to welcome you here. But I follow that protocol where, you know, years ago, we would have asked, can we pass through your land? We'll care for it in the ways that you require us to care for it, and that we learn what we can. One of our big learnings with students here is about the Aboriginal definition of health, and I just wanted you to keep it in your minds throughout this symposium tonight. That it's not just the physical well-being of an individual, but it refers to the social, emotional and cultural well-being of the whole community, in which each individual is able to achieve their full potential as a human being, thereby also bringing about the total well-being of the community. And it's a whole of life view that includes the cyclical concept of life, death and life. Now, we're all part of this whole community for Aboriginal people here, but also for those who come to this country. And I just wanted to leave you with a beautiful quote from Uncle Bobby Randall. It's from a film, Kanyini, freely available through the UNSW library website or other places if you have a little look for it on the internet. And he says, "We have one mother. This land we're living on and taking everything from, she is our mother. And you and me, this makes us brothers and sisters." So I really wish you all the very best from the Murumari Indigenous Health Unit for the symposium tonight. Thanks.
I'm Raina McIntyre, the Head of School of Public Health and Community Medicine. Welcome to UNSW. The school is pleased to host this event and highlight important issues around public health, human rights and asylum seeker detention. I thank the Public Health Association of Australia for co-sponsoring this event and for their tireless advocacy in many important public health issues. I also commend The Guardian for their frank and fearless coverage of this issue. It was the open letter from the doctors on Christmas Island, including Dr. Sangaran, who's speaking tonight, which prompted us at the school to discuss the human rights of asylum seekers and what we as a school could do. The idea for this symposium arose from those discussions. Professor Heather Worth, who heads Global Health at UNSW, has driven this event with a team of dedicated staff, and we at the school are deeply concerned about the abuse of human rights of vulnerable people and hope that this forum today can make a difference. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our opening speaker, Emeritus Professor Gillian Triggs, the President of the Australian Human Rights Commission. Professor Triggs took up this appointment by the Commonwealth Attorney General in 2012. She was previously the Dean of the Faculty of Law and the Challis Professor of International Law at the University of Sydney from 2007 to 12, and Director of the British Institute of International and Comparative Law from 2005 to 7. She's a former barrister at 7 Wentworth Chambers and a Governor of the College of Law. Professor Triggs has combined an academic career with international commercial legal practice and worked with governments and international organisations on human rights law. She hopes to focus her presidency on the implementation in Australian law of human rights treaties to which Australia is a party, and to work with nations in the Asia-Pacific region on practical approaches to human rights. Professor Triggs' long-standing commitment to legal education will build upon the Commission's efforts to inform Australians, especially children, about their fundamental human rights. And the Commission is now approximately halfway through the National Inquiry into Children in Immigration Detention in 2014, and will report its findings and recommendations to the Department of Immigration and Border Protection in September this year. The inquiry report will be tabled in Parliament sometime later this year. The President is conducting this administrative inquiry under Section 11(1)(f) of the Australian Human Rights Commission Act 1986 to inquire into any act or practice that may be inconsistent with or contrary to any human right, and report to the Minister the results of such an examination. The Commission cannot foreshadow any findings until the inquiry is complete. Therefore, the President will be limited into what she can say about the progress of the inquiry and will not be able to answer questions in relation to specific findings until the inquiry is complete. She'll be able to describe the inquiry methodology and some emerging themes from the visits, but will not be able to be more specific, make specific statements about whether any acts or practices contravene human rights. So we'd appreciate if you keep your questions within that framework. Thank you. Professor Triggs.
Thank you very much, and thank you for your welcome. I'm sorry about that rather legalistic piece that has to be read out, but as you'll appreciate, as we're halfway through an inquiry, I don't want to say anything that's going to in any way impugn the objectivity of that outcome, so that's really what that's all about. But thank you very much indeed for including me in tonight's event. I do congratulate the organisers from the UNSW School of Public Health and Community Medicine and the Public Health Association of Australia for organising this event, because it is such a vital question for contemporary Australia, and I very much appreciate the opportunity to talk to you just a little bit about our work. Here in this wonderful UNSW hall, may I also acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I'm particularly keen to talk to groups of this kind because one thing I have learned in this job is that it's one thing to know what the law is, but it's quite another to know how that law might apply to the facts. And in our inquiry, we have included professionals, one of whom you'll be hearing from tonight, but from the medical profession, who can look at the condition of those held in detention with an objective and professional eye to help us to produce accurate and balanced information. Because as I'm sure you'll understand, we can't make statements about the physical and mental health of the inmates of detention centres. We have to rely on the professionalism of the medical service providers, and so that really does underpin this inquiry that we've been talking about. So I'd like to begin just with a few facts, just to be clear about the dimensions of what we're discussing, because the number of people in closed immigration detention remains alarmingly high today. At the moment, there are about 4,484 people in immigration detention facilities in Australia, and that includes about 3,000 on the mainland Australia and over 1,500 on immigration detention on Christmas Island, and that includes 895 children. Now, I know that we've heard in the news as of yesterday the report that Robert Cornell has made into the conditions in Manus Island and the death of one asylum seeker, and there has been an enormous media attention upon Manus Island and Nauru, as indeed there should be. But one needs to perhaps also think about the 4,500 people who remain in closed detention, including, as I say, nearly 900 children. There are 2,500 people in offshore processing centres, so-called, held on Nauru and Manus Island, with 179 children on Nauru in those conditions. People who are held in detention are particularly vulnerable to violations of their human rights. And that, of course, is where the Australian Human Rights Commission comes in, because we're lawyers, we're given the task of holding the government to account for complying with the international human rights treaties to which Australia has been such an active and willing and enthusiastic party historically. There are particular challenges to the human rights in relation to children, partly because they have unique developmental rights, and partly, of course, because they have special legal rights under the Convention in relation to children. A key concern, inevitably, is the detrimental impact that long periods of detention, especially in a harsh environment, in a remote location without adequate access to services and support, can have on the mental health of those who've been detained. In my role as President, I've been to all of the detention centres across Australia where children are held. The reality of life in these detention centres is very confronting, especially when those caught up in it are children. And I thought I might give you, if I may, a very personal example. I am a lawyer, I love the law, and I'm very happy to talk about various provisions of the treaties and how they apply under the Migration Act. But I have learned in this job that what really has an impact is to understand the impact on human beings. And I know for many of you as medical service providers, you will understand that very well. But this is a case of an 11-year-old girl, let's call her Roma, whom I met in a detention centre. She had fled from serious conflict in her home country in the Horn of Africa, and she'd been on Christmas Island for 8 months. And she remained quite composed as she told me how her brother had been killed in front of her. She remained composed as she recounted how scared she was of the waves and the sharks in the water as she made the perilous boat journey to Australia. She remained composed as she showed me the sores on her arms that won't heal in the tropical heat, and her bloodshot eyes caused by the phosphate dust on the island. It was only when Roma told me that during her 8 months on Christmas Island, she'd spent just 2 weeks at the local school, and that was essentially a playgroup, that she finally broke down in tears. She knows that to be deprived of an education while in detention is to take away not only her liberty, but her chances for a fulfilled life in the future. And it was that story, I think, that for me is the reverberating story, even though, of course, I have to be concerned about what this means as a matter of law and, of course, of justice. Well, I might take a moment, if I may, to tell you a little bit about how and why we started the National Inquiry into Children, because sadly, we've done all this before. After the Tampers case, you know, we had the offshore solution in Nauru, and the Human Rights Commission, more than 10 years ago, produced a very comprehensive report on the impact of detention upon children in immigration detention where they're asylum seekers. And that report that was handed down in 2004 led to, and we don't claim exclusive responsibility for this, of course, but at least it encouraged the Howard government to release almost all the children within weeks, and all of them by nearly 2 years later. But within a very short space of time, the children were out, and that was when the Howard government introduced the concept of community detention and bridging visas. But you all know that we're now looking at a serious increase in the deterioration of children as asylum seekers, with, as I've said, nearly 900 in closed detention in Australia or Christmas Island, quite outside from those held offshore. So it was a matter of some delicacy as to whether or not we would call this inquiry, because the numbers peaked, as you might recall, in about July last year, when the number of children in detention reached 3,000. However, as we'd moved so close towards an election, we were pretty much in caretaker mode. It really wasn't possible to call the inquiry last year. It also became very clear within a few months of the new government being in power, that the level of information that had previously been available to the Human Rights Commission was now no longer available, nor indeed, I might add, much more importantly, was it available to the public. So we weren't getting accurate information as to how, why and how children were being detained. And so in those circumstances, in about February this year, we decided that we would hold an inquiry, and I have now been to 5 detention centres, along with my colleagues both from the Commission and colleagues from the medical profession. We will also hold public hearings. We've held one, and we're about to hold another in Melbourne, but we are very grateful for receiving any submissions that you might care to make. We've done a lot of interviews, we've done a lot of focus groups, and we've also spent a lot of time with children, interviewing the children with the parents' consent, and asking them, among other things, to draw pictures about their lives. And one of the very sad things is that the children draw us pictures of their lives behind bars, and when they put their identification on the picture, they put their boat number and not their name, which is a very sad phenomenon. Some of you, of course, will be primarily interested in the offshore program to Nauru and Manus Island, and I'm often asked about why I haven't yet been to either. And the answer is one that really lies in the law, and that is that Australian law does not typically have an extraterritorial effect, so my powers do not extend to Nauru and Manus Island. However, I have made the decision that because, and this is a technical legal point, but it's a powerful one, because Australia is at international law legally responsible for all the extraterritorial acts over which it has effective control, I retain the power to hear complaints from Manus and Nauru. And that gives me the power to look at the conditions of the children and to consider complaints either by the children or most particularly by their parents. So that is why you will perhaps see a rather puzzling variation in what I can do. I can't go to Nauru and Manus without the consent of a sovereign country, which I do not have, but I can take formal complaints from those asylum seekers held there. Well, we are concerned, of course, about the human rights in terms of treaty obligations, and I think you'll all be very well aware that the Refugees Convention and the principles of customary international law have requirements that a person persecuted may not be refooled or returned to the place of persecution, and that we also have obligations to assess the claim to asylum seeker status and to have proper rule of law based procedures for considering those claims. One of the most distressing aspects of our onshore position is that for well over a year and a half in many cases, the 25 or so thousand asylum seekers currently in Australia have had their claims have not been assessed. And as I say, 4,500 of those are held in closed detention with no access to the courts and no capacity whatever to have the rightness of their detention considered by the courts. That is an extraordinary phenomenon. I think most of you would think, well, what about habeas corpus? What about the Magna Carta? These are principles which sadly have been overridden by parliamentary processes through the Migration Act itself. So sadly, as a matter of domestic law, where Parliament passes a law that is clear and unambiguous in allowing the detention in these circumstances, that will trump any other fundamental freedom or right that would otherwise exist as a matter of law. So it's a very puzzling situation from the point of view of most of us who take some of these human rights for granted. We mustn't, however, in thinking domestically, forget the growing international concern, and this is something that I think we all need to be aware of. The international community is giving greater scrutiny to the position of asylum seekers and refugees. And when I was in Geneva recently, I was there when the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Navi Pillay, gave a speech to the Human Rights Council to the United Nations, the peak body, in which she called for some review of Australia's policies in relation to asylum seekers, particularly those offshore processing arrangements. Now, I mention this because it is very rare indeed for a Western developed country ever to be mentioned critically by the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. And to do so before the Human Rights Council was extraordinary, very unusual, and we were specifically named and targeted in that report, and we were in the same paragraph as human rights breaches by the Ukraine, North Korea, Sri Lanka and Syria, which gives you some idea of the egregious nature, at least in the perception of the international community. Some of you will also be aware that the United Nations Human Rights Committee has made a ruling that the detention indefinitely of those who have already been adjudged as refugees, but who have a non-appealable, a negative ASIO assessment, that constitutes a breach of the international human rights against arbitrary detention. But it's also, and I've never seen this before in these sorts of cases, the Human Rights Committee went so far as to say that to detain indefinitely in these circumstances with no right of access to the courts was in and of itself a form of cruel and unusual punishment. That is absolutely exceptional, and that those findings and recommendations by the UN Human Rights Committee, which administers the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, has been ignored, and the 2-month period within which Australia was to respond has also gone by without appropriate response. And the last point I wanted to make is that UNHCR, again, the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, Navi Pillay, appointed a special rapporteur for to consider arbitrary detention and to consider in particular the position in Nauru, and he was denied permission to go there. Now, to do that as a snub, effectively, to the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, Navi Pillay, to say nothing, of course, of the rapporteur himself, is a very serious action, and one which I think will not go unnoticed in the United Nations context. What is it that the Human Rights Commission wants? Well, first and foremost, what we want is to see asylum seekers have their claims to refugee status assessed. That's an absolutely fundamental principle of international law that I don't think any country, except occasionally Australia, refutes. And we know statistically and in the past that 90% of asylum seekers whose claims have been assessed have proved to be refugees. We therefore believe that it's absolutely fundamental that those claims be assessed according to a proper rule of law process, subject to proper impartial tribunals to assess the accuracy or otherwise of those assessments. None of that, of course, is happening at the moment. But we're also asking, and it's somewhat controversial, that people be released, that detainees being held in closed detention be released into the community. Whether in community detention or on bridging visas, we don't really care now quite what the terms and conditions are, although we're deeply opposed to the idea of bridging visas that have no work rights, because that simply diminishes their capacity to survive in a healthy way in the future. But our deepest concern, and we have to take these things in bite-sized pieces if you like, our deepest concern lies with the ever-extended period of detention of children in closed detention. The medical evidence is now growing stronger and stronger that the longer, and it's obvious of course, the longer you detain a child or a child's family, the more more their mental health is at risk. But there are other more physical consequences as well, but I'm sure you're a better judge of that than I. So we see that on the department's own statistics, children are now being held in detention for longer than has ever been the case before, in closed detention. And that, I think, should be something that starts to move the hearts and minds of Australians. And so in concluding, I deeply appreciate the fact that you've organised this meeting, and I do hope that from your medical services perspective, public health perspective, you can use your own advocacy to speak out about the conditions of asylum seekers in detention. Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Triggs. Our next speaker is Associate Professor Karen Zwi. Karen is a consultant community paediatrician at the Sydney Children's Hospital and an associate professor at UNSW. In 2006, she chaired the College of Physicians Policy Committee on the Health of Refugee Children in Australia and New Zealand, and continues to be a key advocate for the College on refugee child health matters. She's involved in service development for refugee children in southeastern Sydney and the Illawarra, and she represents the College of Physicians on the Australian Human Rights Commission inquiry into children in detention. Thank you, Karen.
So I have to play with the technology. Good evening, everybody. I'd also like to acknowledge the first peoples of this land, the Aboriginal people joining us here today, and also the last peoples of this land, the asylum seekers who have come to our shores to seek our protection. I'm speaking today not on behalf of the Commission, but as one of the paediatricians that joined the Commission in their visit to Christmas Island and Darwin. I'm just going to speak really tonight about Christmas Island, but I'm really speaking about my own observations as opposed to any findings that the Commission might be making into the future. And also, what I've tried to do is not represent the academic literature or anything that many of you would be aware of in relation to the harms caused by detention, because all of that is well known, but to honour the voices of the children in the way they spoke to us, in the kinds of things that their parents said to us, and in their drawings, because I think they do it so much more eloquently than I can. We have put up in the foyer some of the drawings, poems, and stories given to us by children in detention. I'll skim through things that I think you know, but just by way of very brief background, we have a quota system. We have an offshore program where we accept refugees from refugee camps selected by the UN and resettled in Australia, usually given permanent visas and ultimately citizenship. That is not really the sort of arena that we're talking about at the moment. We're focusing on those asylum seekers that come to our shores predominantly by boat, because those are the people that are subject to the policy of mandatory detention. So mandatory detention means that if you come by boat, you are basically detained as the default option, as opposed to most other countries where you have to have a very specific reason to be kept in detention. This policy applies to children, pregnant women, and essentially anybody who arrives by boat. In general, until recently, people were taken to Christmas Island, and that is where their processing would commence, and then they were resettled, not resettled, but they may be processed in detention somewhere else on the mainland. But since September 2002, and more actively July 2012, and then 2013, we've had a very proactive policy about offshore processing, so nobody who arrives by boat will be processed in Australia. That means even if you're on Christmas Island, no processing will commence, and you will be transferred to Manus Island or Nauru, where your processing will begin. You'll never be resettled in Australia, and there will be no exceptions. So, as Gillian was saying, around 1,000 children in detention at the time that I did this Christmas Island visit. A child is under the age of 18. Children are no longer kept in detention centres. In a technical sense, we call them alternative places of detention, or APODs. The difference between an APOD and a detention centre is somewhat technical. And if you ask how this came to be called an APOD, apart from the signage difference, there are a couple of very tiny differences, like razor wire instead of barbed wire, which I think might escape a 3-year-old's perspective. We spoke unrestricted to detainees. We had about a week on Christmas Island. We were given free access to talk to whomever we wished. We were given lots of interpreters. It was actually a fantastically open environment for us to talk to detainees. At the same time, people handed us letters. Children were given drawing materials. And as I say, I'm presenting some of my observations. That there is a letter from a particular language group. What they've done is fingerprint every child, put their boat number and their age, and then write a letter to us from the children in detention. I've just put up the pictures for you to make your own meaning of them, but very often you see the theme of the fences, the sad children in detention with very distressed faces, and then the children outside with, you know, the flowers and the butterflies, and this child is asking, where's the difference? What's the difference between us and them, of course. 27 babies under a year of age, so lots of young babies. Most of these were born in detention, and almost 200 kids under the age of 5. Around 100 teenagers, this is Christmas Island alone. 42 of whom were unaccompanied children, which means that they had no family adult older than the age of 21 to look after them. This is the kind of facilities people have access to, so they call this donga-style accommodation. It's essentially old shipping containers. They're all in a long row with rooms very close together and a shaded area between. And there will also be a communal eating area where people are served dormitory-style, you know, mess hall food, and there may be a shaded area in the middle of the compound where people can gather in the shade. That's a typical, what they call a family room, so it's 2 single beds. If you happen to have 2 children, they may have to share at the top, mother and baby at the bottom, and you may get a mattress for dad if he's around. And these are called en-suites. You have the luxury of your own toilet, which is good, because those that don't have the en-suites have these really appalling communal toilet facilities for all detainees, clearly insufficient and not well maintained. So that's the typical accommodation that you'll see on Christmas Island. None of these are photographs that we took from inside the detention centre because we weren't allowed permission to do so, but these are all freely available. So what did we find? We really talked to people. We didn't undertake formal medical assessments or medical examinations. So again, these are sort of very general observations. As you'd expect in a tropical climate, lots of infected skin lesions, impetigo, lots of fungal infections of the skin and hair. People complained bitterly about dental problems, dental pain that was keeping children awake at night and not allowing them to eat. And children with special needs really not getting their needs met in the way that we would expect. So children requiring hearing aids or having lost their glasses en route to Australia, or complaining that they couldn't see and hadn't, you know, needed a new pair of glasses or whatever, that would generally not be dealt with in a very timely fashion. Those are the famous Christmas Island crabs. They have been one of the wonders of the world, according to David Attenborough. Tens of millions of them cross from the forest to the sea every year. And they're an endangered species, and you will be fined $3,000 if you drive over a crab. One of the things that the detainees said to us, a few, was that people care more about the crabs on Christmas Island than they do about the detainees. What did we see in terms of child development? We know a lot about the impact of a very harsh physical environment on children's development. Children need a nurturing, safe, stimulating environment in order to develop, and they also need parents who are coping, who are positive, and who are building a sense of safety and future for them. We know a lot about the mental health of adults in detention, so I won't harbour on that point. But the physical space is extremely harsh. What this child has drawn here, and I'm sure Mark will tell you about it on Nauru as well, is this phosphate soil that exists everywhere from the phosphate mines. It's an incredibly harsh, crunchy, painful surface on which to walk, and children cannot be put down to crawl or move around in that environment. And that child has actually drawn those dots. You can see the sort of dots that he's drawn underfoot. Apart from the mental health of parents, there's been very little attention given to appropriate toys and reading materials for parents to read in their own comfortable languages to their children. So all of these, and no shaded areas for play. So there is one in the 3 compounds where children are kept, one of them has a plastic children's playground, unbearably hot during the day. You really can't even touch it with no shade. So I think it's, fairly obvious that children's development cannot be optimized. And in fact, many parents complained about children actually regressing and losing skills that they had once acquired. My child only chooses black colors for painting and clothes to wear. Now, this is actually something we've seen over the years with distressed children. Choosing black as a way of indicating one's distress, one's fear, and one's sadness is a very powerful way for a child to tell you of their distress. Wakes once or twice at night. Lots of parents told us about children not sleeping well. The doctor says to keep away black colors. Really interesting approach in terms of, is that really going to solve the problem? Overwhelmingly, in an institutional environment like this, parents' capacity to be highly functioning parents and the parents that they would like to be becomes extremely undermined, and family functioning itself is very undermined. You can see the privacy, you can see not having meals together undermines the discipline and the family functioning. In addition, people, when they first arrive on Christmas Island, are issued with plastic cutlery and crockery, which they have to keep and look after. 3 times a day, they line up with their plate and their knife and fork and get handed their food at the mess, at the hall. Before they do that, they have to present their boat number, which is much larger than their name, on their ID card, and this is including children. Everybody walks around with their ID card and get ticked off. And in addition to that ticking off, they will be checked at 6 o'clock in the morning and 11 o'clock at night with torches and going around into people's room and checking that they're there. So that head count, the boat numbers that Gillian mentioned, is very prominent. People know each other's boat numbers. When you say, I'm Karen, what's your name? People's first response is, this is my number. When we say, how do people generally refer to you? The response was, well, it's like our boat number is our first name. The other thing that was very undermining for mothers of young children is this kind of rationing system. So you got a certain amount of nappies and a certain amount of milk powder. And it's very interesting because in other mainland detention centres that does not occur. That is not part of the policy. It is not necessary, but it had become the kind of culture of Christmas Island. So you had to line up for your nappies. When those were finished, you had to go back into the queue and ask for more nappies, which is very undermining for a parent who may just have had a cesarean section, who doesn't feel like getting up and going to, ask for these basic facilities. What came through very, very strongly is that people came with skills and felt very motivated when they first arrived to use their skills and found it very difficult to understand why they couldn't. So as Gillian was saying, the kids weren't going to school. We had a university-educated maths teacher who said, I'm more than happy to teach these kids. But she wasn't allowed to undertake that activity. Similarly, there was a chef who was happy to assist in the kitchen. There was a plumber who had noted various, defects and leaking toilets and bits and pieces around the place, but he wasn't allowed to use his skills. And so people talk a lot about this boredom, frustration, and losing my mind. We know in the literature it takes 3 to 4 months for adults to lose their mind or to start declining cognitive function in this sort of setting. For children, we believe it's much more in the region of 2 to 4 weeks, which is why all the recommendations say you shouldn't hold children at all, and if so, maximum of 2 weeks. Single mother of 2 young children. Yesterday I smashed chairs. If allowed, I would break all windows. We went through the big ocean and here for 8 months, from a bad situation to a worse situation. When the officers go home, the kids say, shall we go with them one day? I'm so ashamed in front of our kids. So again, the sense of I'm not the parent I know I can be because this environment is not allowing me to be a decent parent. This story of children latching on to people as they left the detention centre, we actually witnessed that several times, where you literally had to pry a child off. They see the people coming and going as their access to freedom, which is terribly sad. Why? I come for Australia, not Nauru or Manus. Everybody knows about Nauru and Manus. Reza Barati had been killed 2 weeks before we arrived. Every child knew Reza Barati's name. I can't back Iran, and they also talk about I can't back, because everybody says, apparently guards will ask, why don't you go back? I can't back, but I'm died. And this is a child who's drawn, tears, the only colour is red, and that's Tony Abbott with a smile on his face. Suicide and self-harm, enormous amount of literature on this in adults, and we know it's 40 times the Australian suicide rate. My concern is, of course, it's horrific for adults, but for children to be a witness to the distress in parents who are meant to be caring for them is really unbearable. A young boy broke the windows. All the kids saw him trying to self-harm with the broken window. We are losing our minds. And then other parents telling us how distressing it was because they couldn't protect their children from witnessing this incident, very well aware that it was harmful for their own children, but they have no capacity to be able to protect their children. Distress and sadness evident. People told us that they were crying themselves to sleep. Children had become withdrawn. They were once reading, weren't reading. They had learned to do something and had forgotten it, lost their motivation, lost their interest in learning. Bedwetting, loads of kids were bedwetting who had been dry just before they arrived. Nightmares, tantrums, playing out their distress in games. This is very well described in a lot of literature where the kids were saying, you be the Serco guard, I'll be the guard, I'll pat you down. Or my boat's drowning, come help save me. And these are the kinds of games they're playing because they're working through their distress. My daughter says to me, Mum, I wish I were drowning in the ocean because I think to die once and for all, it's better than every day is dying. People spoke a lot about how they felt a sense of torture, that there was no end in sight, that it just went on and on. Every day was the same, nothing to do. Nobody would tell me what was going to happen next, and that was the torture. The other thing that I think was a little bit of a shock to me was the extent of family separation. So if anybody needed, because Christmas Island is so remote, there are no specialists there or very few visiting specialists. If anybody needs any specialist attention or even allied health assessment, they have to be flown over to Darwin. There are limited flights, limited numbers of seats on the flight. You need guards with every detainee, etc., etc. Multiple logistical problems. And although the department policy is not to separate families, ultimately, pragmatically, families were separated. For medical appointments, for childbirth, nobody gives birth on Christmas Island. They had got into the habit, again, not necessarily the policy and not necessary on the mainland, of when a child turns 18, he would be separated from his family of origin and put in the adult male compound, which is a much more harsh environment and which often meant he no longer had access to those precious 2 weeks at school. The 40 unaccompanied children were an amazing group of kids from all over the world. Afghanistan, Somalia, come from enormous distances, had been en route to Australia for weeks to months, typically. You'll all know about the well-described conflict of interest in that these children their legal guardian is the Minister for Immigration, who is also responsible for enacting the policy of mandatory detention. So whereas in a child rights sense, acting in their best interests would be nurturing them, reading to them, getting them to school and doing their homework, keeping them in detention cannot possibly be in their best interest, and there's an obvious conflict of interest. Nonetheless, he doesn't take that on himself, the minister, but delegates it to the centre manager, who's actually really busy with a full-time job, and this is not a job that is taken on as a major activity. It's only a bureaucratic role that comes up when there's a problem or a signature is required. The kids described how if they claimed to be under 18, there was a very rigorous process where they had to front up and answer questions for as long as an hour and a half about when they were born, what was going on, how old were their parents, how old were their siblings, lots of questions that they didn't have the answers to, at the end of which it was determined whether they were under 18 or over 18, and during this process no advocate is present, so they're very much alone in that process. And they also talked very sadly about their fear of transfer. When they turn 18, they may be sent to Nauru or Manus, their perception was we'll go there to die, like Reza Barati, or even just separation from their family of origin to the adult detention centre. They talked about how they'd been on very long journeys with their friends had become their family. They get woken at 6 in the morning, given half an hour to pack their things, and then told, okay, you're off to this place or that place, without an opportunity to say goodbye to people that they've become very close to. Nonetheless, children are children, and adolescents amaze me, and they were still very hopeful in between the tears. And I loved this young woman who said, we need to keep smiling, and one day life will get tired of upsetting us and make the rest of our lives beautiful. For me, these kids could teach our children so much. Their main aim in life was to get an education. They wanted to be the next generation of educated Australians, is the way they put it. So we know all these synergistic risks. They're well described: the parental hopelessness, reduced parental autonomy, lack of a safe environment, inadequate play and educational facilities, witnessing traumatic events. These accumulate to produce a much poorer mental health and developmental outcome in children. And these are known to the government as well. This is very well documented literature. Unfortunately, the protective factors are few and far between. The access to education outside of the centre was really not well enacted, and most people had been for 2 weeks. And for younger children, there really was almost nothing to give them an escape from this harsh environment. Adults talked a lot about the sense of injustice, that they boarded the boat, you know, or they started their journey many months before these new regulations came in, and they were really quite shocked about the fact that they wouldn't be processed or ever resettled in Australia. They were very distressed, the fact that there was absolutely no processing. Nobody had asked any questions. So very often we heard, thank you for listening, you're the first person I've told my story to. Some people showed us the UNHCR refugee cards. They had already been processed in Indonesia. I don't know the numbers, but because they were awaiting resettlement, they hopped on a boat and arrived. The fact that they'd been reprocessed, already processed, is irrelevant because our regulations were no processing will be undertaken. So that was very frustrating for them. They were gathered together. They told us every few days to be told, you will never be resettled in Australia. And when people said, well, where will we go? The answer very often was, and probably still is today, we really don't know. Maybe Nauru, maybe Cambodia, maybe PNG, but this incredible sense of uncertainty and where will I be in 5 years' time, nobody has any idea. People said to us, I've done a crime. Okay, I get that. I came by boat. I'm not supposed to. What's the sentence? I'll do that, and then can we get on with our lives? Uncertainty. Nobody had legal advice, even though legally I understand that they do have a right to do so, but there's so many barriers that it's just not possible. What have I done if I was born in a dictatorship country? What wrong have we done that we seek asylum to you? What wrong have our children done that they come with us? Does not it a great catastrophe for parents and society? We must not weeping for this terrible issues. And again, I don't know what I must reply to our children, that powerlessness of parents trying to protect their children. So we know about the Convention of the Rights of the Child. I'll leave it to you to think whether we are violating any of those. And finally, that's the giant robber crab. That's the biggest terrestrial invertebrate on the planet. It is the only, Christmas Island is the only place it exists, and apparently the detention centre and the phosphate mining have placed it in danger. And I thought it was rather interesting. That very beautiful bird is also near extinction, and it's called the Abbott's booby. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Karen. Our next speaker is Dr. Michael Grukog, who is Deputy Director of the Kaldor Centre for International Refugee Law. He teaches criminal law, criminology and penology at the University of New South Wales. Prior to commencing his PhD at UNSW in 2004, he worked as a solicitor and researcher in London for 13 years, specialising in criminal, prison and immigration law. And he also spent 3 years working as a legal and policy officer for the Howard League for Penal Reform, focusing mainly on teenagers in the criminal justice system. More recently, his research interests have included border policing and state crime. Border Crimes, Australia's War on Illicit Migrants is Michael's latest book, and he's co-author of the 5th edition of David Brown's Criminal Laws, of which the 6th edition is forthcoming. Thank you, David. Michael.
Well, I'd like to thank Heather Worth and the organisers of the conference for the opportunity and the invitation to speak today. These are clearly very important discussions. It's clearly very important for discussion of this type to be taking place, especially when the government is seeking to restrict the level of disclosure and public debate of its border policing policies. What's going on in our borders are not operational matters. They're matters of crucial importance for the entire Australian community. I was asked to speak about the human rights issues arising from offshore processing, which is both a bleak and potentially open-ended task. So I'm going to limit my comments to 3 main issues. Firstly, I want to give a very brief outline of some of Australia's formal human rights obligations that are relevant to refugees, and some of those have already been touched upon. Secondly, I want to discuss what I would regard to be the systemic breaches of these obligations, and especially those arising from offshore processing. And thirdly, and very briefly, more briefly than is probably helpful in some ways, I want to conclude with an alternative framework for responding to forced migration in our region. Now, Australia is a signatory to a number of human rights instruments that are relevant to refugees. Mostly, these go to issues of detention and forced removal. For example, Articles 9, 1 and 10 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights prohibit arbitrary arrest and detention and require that all persons deprived of their liberty be treated with humanity and respect for the inherent dignity of the person. Similarly, Article 16 of the Convention Against Torture obliges signatory states to prevent acts of cruel, inhuman or degrading treatment. Article 37 of the Convention of the Rights of the Child requires that children not be subjected to cruel, inhuman or degrading treatment, that detention be a measure of last resort and for the shortest appropriate time, and that detained children should be treated with humanity and respect. Moreover, Articles 20 and 22 of the Convention of the Rights of the Child provide unaccompanied children or those whose family environment is unsafe with a right to special protection and humanitarian assistance. And you can draw your own conclusions from what you've just heard about how well those obligations are being met. Finally, Articles 12 and 13 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights provides for a right to enjoyment of the highest attainable standards of mental and physical health and a right to education. Taken as a whole, this snapshot of Australia's human rights commitments places a premium on individual liberty and personal security. It conceptualises detention as an exceptional measure of last resort and it places expectations on signatory states such as Australia to promote such commitments and to ensure more than just bare minimum compliance. However, as the Australian Human Rights Commission, the Commonwealth Ombudsman, the UN Human Rights Committee, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, various NGOs and parliamentary inquiries have documented extensively, there have been numerous breaches of these and other human rights standards by successive Australian governments for at least the past 20 years. Now, I don't have time to catalogue the various human rights abuses that have been identified, but I do want to suggest that they are systemic, that they arise from conscious government and immigration department policies, and that they are certain to be replicated, if not exacerbated, by the return to offshore processing that we have witnessed since August 2012. The systemic mistreatment of those seeking unauthorised entry into Australia in order to claim asylum is linked to the evolution of a border policing regime that has its most immediate origins in the introduction of mandatory detention in 1992. The main operational goal of this regime has been to limit and ultimately prevent access to Australian jurisdiction by those seeking protection from persecution in accordance with Australia's obligations under the 1951 Refugee Convention. Now, these obligations are quite limited. Although Article 14 of the UN Declaration on Human Rights provides for a general right to seek asylum, the 1951 Convention confines signatory states to two key commitments. First, Article 31 requires that refugees should not be penalised for unauthorised entry. And second, Article 33 prohibits refoulement or return to a place where a person might face persecution, typically, although not always, their state of origin. Now, successive Australian governments have interpreted these obligations very narrowly, if not ignored them altogether. Thus, when mandatory detention of all unlawful non-citizens was introduced in 1992, the then Labor government argued explicitly that one of its purposes was to deter further unauthorised boat arrivals. The obvious punitive impacts were either justified as an unfortunate necessity or deemed formally not to be punitive, a legal construction reinforced by the High Court of Australia in cases such as Al-Kateb in 2004, which held that indefinite detention was not unconstitutional because it was for administrative rather than punitive purposes, which wasn't much consolation to Mr. Al-Kateb. The profoundly abusive nature of indefinite immigration detention has been extensively documented. One of the most compelling accounts, and one which cuts through the dry legal reasoning of the High Court, was provided by South Australian psychiatrist John Gerardini, whose experiences of treating detainees at the Woomera and Baxter immigration detention centres were expressed to Senate committees in 2005 and 2007. And I just want to briefly quote from those two submissions. He's talking here about his first visit to the Baxter Centre, which is now closed, but which was purpose-built near Port Augusta. A man I have not met before invites me into his room at Baxter to meet his wife. Baxter was described as an improvement on Woomera, en suites, computers, playing fields. For this man, his wife and 3 children, there were 2 rooms, each a 3-metre cube with a bunk bed and just enough space to enter. I have never been in this room before. It is dark and I am disoriented. It doesn't feel right for a room to be so dark in late morning in the desert. As my eyes adjust, I see the man stooping over the bunk, a woman's face, eyes closed, but finally opening at his insistence. She looks around, frightened, and within seconds she is keening, half scream and half moan. It builds and continues unrelentingly. Her husband tries to quiet her, looks to me appealing, a little challenging. The moaning scream continues. I don't want to compound the harm that has been done to this woman, who has not spoken for 2 years, not walked for 2 months, who crawls to the toilet, is carried to the shower, screams when anyone but her husband approaches her, keeping even her children away. I leave and she screams on. A couple of years earlier, Dr. Gerardini had written to a Senate committee, a Senate inquiry into the Migration Act in these terms. The implementation of immigration detention over the last 5 years has caused severe psychological damage to detainees. I know of no other cohort where such universal mental ill health has been demonstrated. Parents have been crippled by their experiences to a point that they could not protect their children, and all children have been damaged by having witnessed frightening violence and adult self-harm. Most single men who have been in detention for longer periods of time are grossly damaged. And he goes on to conclude, better mental health services in detention will not help because the environment is so toxic that meaningful treatment cannot occur. It is not clear to what degree that detainees will recover, but some show significant signs of continued traumatisation a year after release. In relation to its non-refoulement obligations, the Australian Government asserts its compliance with Article 33, but regards it has no obligation to monitor the safety of those who have been returned after being refused refugee status. Two reports by the Edmund Rice Centre at the Catholic University in 2004 and 2006 documented some 80 cases where asylum seekers returned by the Australian authorities, mainly from Nauru during the period of the first Pacific solution, to states such as Afghanistan or third countries like Pakistan, were placed at risk. In some of these cases, travel documents issued to returnees by Australian immigration officials were not accepted. In others, documents were confiscated or expired soon after return. More recently, there have been reports of Tamil asylum seekers being arrested upon being returned to Sri Lanka, not least because it is a criminal offence in Sri Lanka to leave the country without an exit permit. However, the Australian government's decision to give 2 patrol boats to Sri Lanka to assist their border policing efforts, and Australia's refusal to support even a US-backed UN resolution calling for an international investigation into alleged war crimes committed since 2009 in Sri Lanka, indicate the priority being placed on preventing unauthorised refugee movement rather than focusing seriously on its causes. Now, since the introduction of mandatory detention, Australian border policing has essentially gone through 4 phases. The first, the period in the 1990s, where we witnessed the consolidation of mandatory detention on the Australian mainland, which for all its shortcomings ultimately resulted for most of those who were detained in resettlement in Australia. The period between 2001 and 2007, the period of the first Pacific solution, where we saw the introduction of offshore processing on Nauru and PNG, and resettlement elsewhere, but again, despite the government's rhetoric, mostly people ending up in Australia. And then the period between 2007 and about halfway through 2012, during the period of the first Rudd and Gillard governments, mainland detention or detention on Christmas Island, various attempts to pursue so-called regional solutions such as the Regional Processing Centre on Timor-Leste, but again, ultimately resettlement in Australia. But then finally, the current situation, which we can date back to August 2012, the reintroduction of offshore processing and detention on Nauru and PNG, the excision of the entire Australian mainland from the migration zone, so even if you manage to turn up in a port in Darwin, you're not technically in Australia for the purposes of claiming asylum. And since July 2013, processing offshore on Nauru and PNG, and no prospect, no guarantees, or no undertakings there will be any resettlement in Australia. Now, the dominant narrative underpinning each of these phases is that the so-called legitimate refugees are those who arrive through resettlement arrangements, entirely on terms defined by the Australian government, while refugees seeking access by unauthorised means are to be penalised because of their means of travel. This not only denies the realities of forced migration, which is characterised precisely by the absence of orderly resettlement queues and authorised means of travel, but also fundamentally conflicts with the spirit of the 1951 Refugee Convention and the conception of a refugee as someone who, because of experiences and ongoing fears of persecution, requires protection from another state, regardless of their travel arrangements. The current cynical and myopic iteration of this narrative is that stopping the boats is necessary to prevent refugees risking their lives at sea. But those risks are generated primarily by the absence of formal migration options and the precarious circumstances in which refugees find themselves stranded in transit states such as Malaysia and Indonesia. Moreover, by exporting its obligations to Nauru and PNG, the Australian government shows little regard for the increased risk to personal safety associated with detention, removal, or resettlement in those states, or the human rights records within those states more generally. In 2012, the Gillard government made the decision to return to offshore processing on Nauru and PNG, and in light of the High Court's earlier rejection of the so-called Malaysia swap deal, on the grounds that the Malaysian government's assurances were insufficient to fulfil Australia's human rights obligations, the Migration Act was amended so that the Immigration Minister can declare a country suitable for regional processing on the sole grounds that the Minister believes this would be in the national interest. In making that decision, immigration was not required to refer to international domestic law of the country in question. Instead, the Minister satisfies the assurance government's question. The refugees will not be forcibly returned, and the consideration of status of the refugee will be made in accordance with the Refugee Convention. However, the decision to designate PNG and regional processing countries were made before any permanent facilities or legal processes were put in place in those states. In the case of PNG, the Minister made the designation before serious concerns raised by the UNHCR were even tabled in Parliament as required. And both the designations of PNG and Nauru, for reasons such as those, are being currently challenged before the High Court. Now, there can be little doubt that a key element of the Australian government's strategy is to use the prospect of indefinite detention in PNG and Nauru, and the uncertain and possibly dangerous prospects of resettlement in PNG and Nauru, and now it seems Cambodia, as a deterrent to refugees seeking unauthorised entry into Australia. There is also a little doubt that Australia is only able to put this regime in place because of its dominant economic and political role in the region. Nauru in particular, with a population barely exceeding 10,000 and its traditional income from phosphates exhausted, is heavily dependent upon Australian aid. However, while the Australian government is determined to devolve fundamental elements of its border policing and refugee determination processes to neighbouring states, it cannot absolve itself of the moral responsibility for the welfare of refugees under its effective control, nor its obligations under international law, even if there are limits to how international law is capable of holding the government to account. And there are a number of ongoing human rights concerns which I want to look at. The first is the arbitrary transfer and detention of asylum seekers. Since August 2012, and again this has been touched on, any person who arrives is liable to be forcibly transferred, including unaccompanied children, even though the Australian government has guardianship responsibilities. As of the 30th of April, 1,177 people were detained on Nauru, including at least 190 children and at least 10 unaccompanied children. This plainly ignores the principles of last resort for detention, of treatment with dignity and respect, and arguably is a form of refoulement, especially in relation to PNG. Second issue is the access to Australian jurisdiction. For legal purposes, for the purposes of refugee determination and for obtaining a protection visa, there is now no access to Australian jurisdiction, despite asylum seekers being detained and transferred at the behest of the Australian government, subject to controls enforced and funded by the Australian and enforced and controlled by the Australian government, in clear abrogation of Australia's overall responsibilities. Thirdly, while both PNG and Nauru are signatories to the Refugee Convention, neither has developed refugee determination processes or mechanisms for implementing and monitoring human rights standards more generally. Procedures for assessing claims of those transferred by Australia were put in place after the agreements were signed to enable offshore processing. So far, about 20 decisions have been made on Nauru and approximately 25 in PNG. 13 have been accepted as refugees by Nauru and 11 by PNG. However, in PNG, these decisions are recommendations only. The final decision with the Minister has yet to be made, and there is no review at this stage by an independent tribunal or court. In Nauru, legislation passed in Nauru in 2012 provides for the establishment of a refugee status review tribunal, but it is difficult to envisage this being established in a country with such minimal infrastructure as Nauru without significant Australian input. There are clearly serious concerns about the standard and safety of detention centres. of poor living conditions and the adequacy of medical facilities. And again, this has been touched on. I'm sure others will develop this later as we go along. On 26th of May, Fairfax Media reported a report by the International Health and Medical Services that approximately half those detained on Nauru and Manus Island were suffering from significant depression, stress or anxiety. There are also clearly concerns about the general levels of safety within the offshore detention centres. The worst example, as I'm sure you'll all be aware, arises from the events which took place on Manus Island almost exactly 100 days ago in February this year. 60 people were injured, including one man who had his throat and neck cut, allegedly by a G4S employee, and the death of Reza Barati after a rock was dropped on his head, again allegedly by a Salvation Army employee, and is subject of the Cornell report, which was yesterday released. Statements from detainees indicate that attacks by PNG indicate that the attacks were made upon detainees in the days prior to the killing by PNG police and detention centre employees. The Australian government, while it's commissioned a report which was released yesterday, has declined calls for more open and thorough judicial investigation, citing essentially this is a matter falls within the jurisdiction of PNG. Questions of whether prosecutions and so on are pursued are matters for the PNG authorities, and essentially Australia has no obligation to pursue the matter further. This reflects a wider lack of transparency, which again has already been mentioned by Gillian, in relation to the lack of information from the Australian government, the denial of access to PNG and Nauru to the Australian Human Rights Commission and to the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, and refusal more generally to grant media visas and access. It also highlights complicated lines of accountability between different governments, policing agencies and private operators, with the Australian government trying to distance itself as much as possible for direct responsibility for what happens within the centres. Finally, there are concerns over the nature and circumstances of voluntary returns, especially given the limitations of resettlement in states like Nauru, PNG and Cambodia. Compared with a wealthy developed country like Australia, the levels of infrastructure and general capacity to facilitate long-term resettlement are minimal. The immediate arrangements are still little more than provisional. In Nauru, those who have been granted refugee status will be issued with 5-year visas, but not even allowed to obtain tourist visas to visit relatives in Australia. In PNG, there are still no final arrangements. Those who have been recognised as refugees, assuming that they get the acknowledgement from the minister in PNG, remain in a secured compound. Cambodia, in the case of Cambodia, while we're still waiting for the release of the Memorandum of Understanding, which will broadly set the terms of any arrangement between the two governments, there are still major concerns about the overall human rights record in that country, including the forced return of Uyghur refugees to China over the past 2 years. In the 2014 World Report, Human Rights Watch described Cambodia as, and I'll quote, engulfed in a human rights crisis. Now, as Hannah Arendt noted in relation to the cumulative measures that stripped millions of Jews, Roma and other minority groups of national and civic rights in the 1930s, enabling them ultimately to be lawfully rounded up and for administrative purposes to be dispatched to so-called labour camps, the concept of inalienable universal rights only has meaning when individual states are willing to give effect to them. Now, while I'm not suggesting that Australian border policing policies amount to genocide, Australian governments nevertheless have deliberately sought to hollow out any sense of personal agency or legitimate aspiration from popular conceptions of human rights. Instead, by pursuing aggressively practices that dehumanise refugees seeking unauthorised entry, for example through the repeated use of labels such as illegals, the use of neutralising terminology, some of which I've used myself, such as processing, transfer and solution, and repeated denial of human rights abuses or obfuscation of investigations into them, successive governments have enabled the Australian state to strip unauthorised refugees of any inherent rights while bestowing upon itself the right to detain, transfer and process refugees effectively as powerless commodities. In this context, identifying and seeking to address human rights abuses remains an important, albeit increasingly challenging task. However, I would also suggest that there is a pressing need to develop an alternative paradigm for viewing and responding to forced migration in the region. And at a minimum, I would suggest that it comprises 4 components. The first is acknowledging that forced migration is an ongoing phenomenon with complex political and socio-economic causes that is not going to be policed or denied out of existence. Second, accepting that unauthorised travel is often a necessary and legitimate response to persecution, insecurity, and the absence of options for formal travel. Third, focusing on large-scale resettlement in Australia as the main vehicle for reducing the risks and precariousness of refugee populations, particularly those stranded in the region. And finally, enabling entry to Australia for the purposes of claiming protection under the Convention, dismantling the detention and offshore processing regimes that penalise unauthorised refugee movement and inflicting systemic physical, psychological harm on asylum seekers seeking entry into Australia. And by chance, in relation to that 4th point, Andrew Wilkie introduced a bill into Parliament today outlining essentially those elements. Of course, given the political realities and the attitudes of the Coalition and the Labor parties, the bill doesn't stand a snowball's chance in hell of getting anywhere in the Parliament. That doesn't make it any less important that it be debated and addressed as a matter of urgency. Thank you.
We're going to do something slightly different from the program because unfortunately one of our panel members, Mark Isaacs, has to go and catch a plane to Darwin and he needs to leave in about 20 minutes. So instead of him being on the panel, we've asked him to answer the question that I sent him earlier this week. So Mark Isaacs is a writer and adventurer. He became impassioned by the Asylum Seeker debate after a visit to Villawood detention as part of his work for Oxfam. In October 2012, Mark went to Nauru to work in the Regional Processing Centre. And it's his experiences of his work in Nauru that form the book that is for sale out on at the UNSW bookshop in the foyer if you want to purchase a copy later. I'd recommend it to you. Mark.
Thank you very much, and thank you for letting me leave early. I'd just like to describe Nauru camp to you guys and let you come to decisions as to whether you think these health standards are up to Australian standards. As Karen described, many of the men were taken from Christmas Island and brought to Nauru Detention Centre at odd times under false pretences, as they claimed. Many of them said they were changing rooms and then found themselves in Nauru. Many of them were told that they were going to Australia and then found themselves in Nauru. Some of the men were brought by force in handcuffs and then brought to Nauru. And with that in mind, they arrive in this distant island in the middle of nowhere and are placed in a detention centre that's very small, rudimentary conditions at best, where they're housed in tents and sleeping on stretcher beds, 8 to 10 men to a tent. Again, with, as Karen said, this shale of like rock that picks up a lot of heat. And so in the middle of the day, these tents reach 50 degrees Celsius. In the wet season, the camp floods. And then just in terms of day-to-day life, the first questions these men asked us were, how long will we be here for? What are we doing here? Why are we here? And these were all questions that we couldn't answer from day one all the way to day 180, and then continuing on. And I think when you place men in these conditions where they have no idea of when they can leave, no idea of what will happen to them when they do leave, no sense of future, no sense of autonomy over their future, and a sense of hopelessness, these conditions start to paint a pretty grim picture. Physically, health-wise, you have a lot of issues already. Things like a specialist were not on the island of Nauru and had to be called in every so often, every few months. So many of the men complained of eye problems that could never be treated, dental problems that were rarely treated. One man I met in Australia after his time in detention, and he was wearing glasses, and I said, I didn't know you wore glasses, and he said, I need them. I can't see without them. So he spent over 10 months in Nauru without wearing any glasses. The medical facilities were limited at best. There were maybe 2 or 3 doctors for several hundred men. One of the IHMS doctors told me, yeah, but that's normal in Australia with Australian kind of patients. But the difference between Australian patients in Nauru that these men often come from traumatized backgrounds, suffering mental illness caused by the conditions in the camp. Within the camp, they also had torture and trauma counsellors. When I asked one of the counsellors what they thought of their work there, they said it was a band-aid on a bullet wound, a box-ticking exercise. The idea of treating torture and trauma while men are being re-traumatized in these camps was almost impossible. But physical conditions alone aren't what make this place so bad. The idea of indefinite detention, the idea that you never know when you can leave. Day 1 is the same as day 2. There's no countdown of detention. There's no idea that in 3 years' time you can tell your family that you'll be gone, that you'll be able to take them to Australia. When there's no progression between days, when day 1 is the same as day 2 and day 2 is the same as day 100, it becomes very hard to see hope. And within a camp where there's nothing to do, no facilities to invoke exercise or invoke entertainment, these days become long and arduous. The days are punctuated by lining up for food 3 times a day. The best story I can give to you of what it's like to live in the camp was the favourite game of the men, and that was to throw a rock at a pole, and the person who hit the pole first won, but that didn't finish the game. You just keep throwing rocks at a pole. Many of these men are fleeing from torture and trauma. Their families are still in these situations of torture and trauma. Their mental state, the routine of their minds was revolving around their families at home and their situation here. As this progressed into nighttime, where there's during the day they've had quite a lack of exercise, it becomes very difficult to sleep. And in these conditions we saw insomnia. And eventually you get this idea that this place is a breeding ground for mental illness. It only took us a few weeks for the first suicide attempts to begin. And that was in the form of using bed sheets to hang themselves, cords from the tents, slashed wrists. One man threatened to jump off a cliff at the back of the camp. One man tried to jump off scaffolding. We saw self-harm in the way of cigarette burns, slash wrists, sewing lips together with blunt paper clips, hunger strikes, thirst strikes. Every attempt to voice these people, to give these people a voice, they tried. And one of the men, I asked him, why do you hurt yourself? And he said, because we don't want to hurt anyone else. Within this camp, as much as the physical conditions improved, because over the time I worked there, the men went from living in tents to living in buildings. The mental conditions deteriorated, I guess, at an alternate rate. So one man, although he was placed in a room by himself, by the time I left, he'd spent 40 days in that room without leaving, and on his wall he'd tattooed a gravestone that said, "I died the day I arrived in Nauru." It was interesting. I actually set up the recreations program in Nauru, and by taking men outside of the camp on excursions, the minute they left the camp, you could see an immediate reaction, an immediate uplifting in their spirits. We saw people smiling, singing, dancing on the buses, and the minute they returned, their mood would go downcast again, and men said to me, "Back to hell." I think when you look at this camp and you look at the physical conditions and the mental conditions, it's very hard to say that these people are treated well with dignity and respect. What almost more confronting was the attitude from a lot of the medical services and the doctors that I worked with. I think it's been well documented that detention for indefinite detention causes mental harm. Many of the doctors ignored this. One of the doctors told me that she thought that they deserved this because they'd come to Australia by illegal methods. Some of them said that the Nauruan people don't get as good as these people, so why should they be treated well? And it's true, the Nauruan facilities are limited. One of my friends had to frequent the Nauruan hospital, and some of the doctors weren't sure how to stitch his head back together after he'd cracked it open on the ground. When men suffered extreme cases, they were taken to the Nauruan hospital. One particular example I can account for is a man who was on hunger strike, and he'd been on hunger strike for over a month. And the medical staff and the caseworkers that worked in the detention centre reported this to the Department of Immigration, saying this man needs to be taken to Australia or else he will die. And he was taken to the Nauruan hospital, and every time he passed out, they'd put a drip back in him and bring him back to life, in a sense. And eventually, he was taken back to taken to Australia to be treated. When he recovered, they told him they'd move him into a transitory accommodation and settle him in Australia. Instead, they'd put him on a plane and send him back to Nauru. And I think this is what outlines one large part of this for me, is the vindictiveness of this policy. Apart from the physical and the mental conditions, the government have done many small acts that many people don't see in Australia that really represent the true nature of these camps, which is, in my opinion, to grind people into dust and to make them so unhappy that they will not try and get to Australia. And another example I can give of that is a man who had actually taken to Australia to be treated for, I think it was a liver or kidney, I can't remember exactly. It's in the book, you can read it. And they said he needed surgery or else he would die. And so he was taken there and he was booked in for a surgery appointment in 3 weeks' time. And after maybe a few days, they found another surgery appointment that was much quicker, maybe in 2 days' time. And they said, you have to take this. And he said, no, I'm okay, I'll wait for the 3-week one. And so they deported him back to Nauru. In my opinion, this camp is detrimental to these people's health. The Australian government know what's happening. The only outcome of this policy is to give these people mental illnesses. I saw people go crazy. I had friends of mine who I worked with attempt suicide. I witnessed doctors treating people badly, and I witnessed a complete lack of facilities for these men. And I think the only conclusion we can draw is that this is a purposeful policy to make people not come to Australia. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark. I'd now like to welcome Dr. John Paul Sangaran, who is a doctor trained at Griffith University in Queensland, who worked on Christmas Island, and he was one of the signatories on the open letter, which was published in The Guardian, and he's currently doing his general practice registrar in Brisbane. Thank you.
Sorry. Good evening. I apologise for largely reading this speech, but I need to be careful with my words. I worked as a medical officer on Christmas Island within the immigration detention centres. This was shortly after the implementation of the rapid processing policy. This period was described as high intensity by International Health and Medical Services, the private entity contracted to run health services throughout the Australian Detention Centre network. Whilst there, I developed concerns over both the human rights of detainees and the medical care provided to them. This culminated in the writing of an extensive document which took pains to pin concerns to evidence and patient examples. This document found its way into the media and was published in a redacted form through The Guardian. IHMS named me as the principal author of the document. I wish to take this opportunity to speak as an opportunity to address the content of the document and the reaction to it. A useful way to understand my concerns is to attempt to put yourself in the shoes of an asylum seeker being brought to Christmas Island. A typical new arrival has been on a rickety boat for a few days to several weeks, often exposed to the sun, wind and rain. There is no access to sanitation or toilet facilities. The boats are cramped, dirty and too frequently with insufficient food and water. The Australian Navy finds you and after varying lengths of time brings you ashore onto an island in the Indian Ocean. Without ensuring all your basic needs are met, as defined by the Australian Human Rights Commission, including a shower, a change of clothes, adequate sleep, food and water, you are herded into the shed to be processed. In this condition, where your ability to consent to medical care is questionable at best, you are sat around and through group translation, using documents you likely cannot read, you are put through an extended induction. During this process, you are separated from your belongings. Critical for medical care, this includes your health information, such as specialist letters and medical records. There might be ultrasound reports from your current pregnancy. All of this information will be difficult to retrieve and is almost invariably lost to you and the doctors attempting to care for your health. Your medications, many of which will not be available on the island for perhaps weeks, are parted from you. These medications were in fact being destroyed by a couple of nurses popping pills into a rubbish bin with no records being kept of what medications were being destroyed or who they belonged to. You might have medical aids that you can no longer access. This included glasses, hearing aids, and parts of a prosthetic leg. I never saw a replacement for any of these. I don't know anyone that had. You then sit around through multiple assessments with the AFP, customs, mental health. There are blood tests and several vaccinations. One part of this is a medical assessment. Braggingly, one doctor recounted that he had done 90 in an 8-hour shift. The supposed purpose of this assessment is to collect your entire health history to ensure suitability for placement within an immigration detention centre and to pick out those requiring urgent detention, as well as to find those that will be too risky to send to offshore processing. The volume required to be processed in the time available is medically dangerous. As predicted by peak bodies such as the Royal Australian College of Physicians, these assessments are completely unreliable and errors occur. There are gross abnormalities which are not picked up. Unfortunately, due to confidentiality, I am unable to give examples. This process is supposed to be carried out according to guidelines put down by the Department of Immigration itself. It should include specific laboratory tests and specialist review where indicated. These fail to occur. The implementation of rapid processing over time meant the rigour of the assessment was cut back piece by piece until the few bloods that are taken are not returned in time to be reviewed before sending detainees offshore centres such as Madison Nauru. Conditions and symptoms which would have prevented you from being transferred no longer applied, and a tolerance for more medically risky transfers was adopted. One might ask, as several did, why bloods were taken at all if the results were not to be reviewed before transfer. This haste led to incidences such as pregnant women being administered contraindicated vaccines. IHMS admitted through their management to their staff that the reason for rapidly processing new arrivals was a political imperative. This while also acknowledging that their care delivered is below the contracted aim of Australian healthcare equivalence. In preparation for transfer, detainees are mass prescribed Malarone for malaria prophylaxis without individual consultation. The norms and standards of medical practice are so distorted within this environment that mass prescription, without discussing the purpose of the drug, is something that I got halfway through myself before waking up to the fact that it was both unethical and dangerous. It wasn't even clear that the detainees were to receive an explanation of what the medication was for. Whilst things certainly worsened during rapid processing from July to September, the problems did not start then. There is evidence of similar complaints having been made over years. These complaints obviously did not result in effective positive change to the system. If you are not to be transferred offshore and are to be detained on Christmas Island, then you have many healthcare challenges ahead. You will experience multiple requests to see a health professional. Detainees frequently complain that they'd been trying to see a doctor for weeks and months. Once you get an opportunity to see a doctor, you'll be summoned by your boat number, as I know many people here have commented on, not your name. It's a thoroughly dehumanising practice. The healthcare staff looking after you will be using a universally recognised substandard health informatics system that routinely loses information critical to your care. The effects of this cannot be overstressed, resulting in prescribing errors, medication dispensing errors, and poor management of critical results. During a period of high arrivals, doctors that would otherwise have been rostered to clinics within the camp had their time consumed with clinically worthless health assessments. It was reflected back to staff that the government was not willing to pay for more doctors to deal with the capacity constraints, and IHMS would not pay for overtime. As a result, the clinics shut down and you could simply not be seen. One doctor expressed the situation by recounting his experience of walking into Lilac Camp. The doctor was confronted with women crying out and coming forth, carrying sick, floppy infants, pleading for medical treatment. The private company IHMS is aware of these issues and has been aware of them for an extended period in the order of years. If you're a child held on Christmas Island, despite a clear duty of care, your health service provider does not effectively advocate on your behalf. It is quite clear that there are serious long-term negative health effects to holding children in detention. The Royal Australian College of Physicians calls for an immediate end to the practice of detaining children. Despite this, IHMS enables their detention by nominally providing a healthcare service. There is inadequate screening for nutritional deficiencies, inadequate testing of sight and hearing, no monitoring of growth and development, none of the routine physical and developmental assessments that would normally occur take place. There is no child-specific mental health service on the island. Additionally, they are receiving only an excuse of an education, sharing on a rotating basis limited places in a local school. We are not doing so much as looking for the problems that we know will arise. This in a population of children that have been exposed to war, loss of family, cultural dislocation, and numerous other serious trauma, including physical abuse and worse. During your detention, if you had a serious medical issue that Christmas Island was unable to deal with, then you face unacceptable and dangerous delays in your care. The concentration of resources on rapid processing led to a backlog of patients requiring transfer. In fact, a backlog on the awareness of patients that required transfer. This is in the context of planes being chartered to Manus and Nauru with great frequency. The urgency with which some of these patients needed specialist and often surgical care cannot be emphasised enough. Tragically, it was often due to the conditions of detention that their urgent medical need had arisen in the first place. There are cases of people whom, because of their detention, suffered conditions which put them in a potentially life-threatening situation. They will probably suffer lifelong complications as a result. These patients were frequently advocated for by medical officers, but efforts were stifled due to a contrived limitation on the capacity of transfer places, postponement by faceless individuals within the department who had never actually reviewed the patient. We were told that the Department of Immigration was accepting the risk for delaying transfers. I cannot accept that a governmental department can absolve me of my professional responsibility to my patients. It cannot remove my duty of care. There are some individuals which from their day of arrival were clearly not suitable for the immigration detention setting. They were flagged as such, often repeatedly and forcefully by doctors coming into contact with them. An unfortunate example of this are the disabled, whom cannot be cared for on Christmas Island due to the non-existence of appropriate medical devices and staff. If people were aware of the situation that individuals with disabilities and their family members face in attempting to care for them, I cannot believe there would not be widespread outrage. If you are a pregnant woman, then you do not have access to the basic standards of antenatal care. Even the Christmas Island Doctor's Handbook is clear about patients receiving standard antenatal care. The guidelines set out by RANZCOG make no bones about the fact that the remoteness of a woman does not impact on her right to good quality antenatal care. This is, of course, ignoring that this is a contrived remoteness in the first place. The lack of access to ultrasound meant there were no dating scans, there was poor access to morphology scans, even in the event of potential iatrogenic harm through the mistakes from rapid processing. If you found yourself in a position where you were seeking a termination, the wait meant you could progress to a point where it was no longer feasible. If you had a threatened miscarriage, irrespective of the gestation, there is no access to appropriate obstetric services. The difficulty with transfers meant that you may not see an appropriate specialist within a reasonable time or indeed at all. Perhaps more alarmingly, you might be singled out as an example, a form of deterrence to others, to send a message that irrespective of your condition and the inherent risks to your health and that of your unborn child, you will still be sent to offshore processing. A case in point is the well-publicised issues around an asylum seeker thought to be carrying twins that the media has dubbed Latifah. This woman was thought to be carrying twins by medical staff on Christmas Island, but it was unable to be confirmed due to the lack of obstetric ultrasound. It gives the impression of ignorance to the point of incompetence, or that of dishonesty, that the minister would berate and chastise reporters, saying, "I strongly suggest that media should more thoroughly interrogate the sorts of claims that are being represented to you." This as a response, denying that a woman carrying twins had been sent to Nauru. This after his practice of minimising transparency. As far as we knew, she was pregnant with twins when she was sent. Medical staff that expressed concern were given assurances that Nauru could handle it. We would have known that she was carrying a singleton pregnancy if basic standards of antenatal care had been met. There is much more that was contained in the document, ranging to accreditation of facilities, concerns about breaches of the Australian Practitioner Health Code of Conduct. The President of the Australian Human Rights Commission, Gillian Triggs, when commenting on the document, and I'm pleased you're here with us, said, "The 15 medical practitioners make a powerful and credible statement that shouldn't be ignored. Sadly, Professor Triggs, I feel our work has largely been ignored. These concerns have, at least in part, have been repeatedly expressed by those who have been involved before us. This is despite repeated promises to address the issue." Despite 18,000 words of detailed concerns, there has been no adequate response. There is a single page we have received from IHMS, and I got to see a demo of their new IT system. I in fact fear repercussions because I have spoken out. It is those same fears born of confidentiality clauses in contracts and the culture of secrecy that serves to silence, that prevents good people from raising their voices. There are many individuals for which I have ongoing concern. I do not know how they have progressed. Unfortunately, due to my experience working in that system, I do not have confidence that they somehow now receive appropriate care. There are still children in detention, a situation that I, as a doctor and a father, cannot accept. Neither does the UNHCR or peak Australian medical bodies. We have the capacity to provide adequate care to this vulnerable population, and all of us have the ethical responsibility to do so. To continue in this manner is a disgrace and shameful to all of us who call themselves Australian. I thank you for your time, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you very much, Sean Paul. Now I'd like to call up to the stage all the speakers, but particularly Dr. Michael Moore, Dr. Anne Clark, and Professor Mark Harris. But Professor Triggs and Dr. Sangren and Michael, please come in. And Karen. We're now going to move, is that on? We're now going to move on to a panel discussion, which I'll moderate. My name is Heather Worth, and I'm run Global Health at UNSW, which is based at the School of Public Health and Community Medicine. As And I'm going to ask a series of questions to a particular panel member. After that, I'll ask anybody else who wants to have a little go, and then we're going to ask for questions from the floor. You can ask about any of the issues that have been discussed here today. Okay, I'm going to start with Michael Moore. Michael Moore is a former Australian politician and health academic who was an independent member of the Australian Capital Territory Legislative Assembly. He is the Chief Executive Officer of the Public Health Association of Australia, and the Public Health Association of Australia has joined with us in presenting this symposium. The PHAA has called for immediate action to improve access to health services for vulnerable asylum seekers in offshore detention centres. Now, Michael, my little question. In its manifesto, the World Health Organization emphasises the link between health and human rights. As the head of the lead Public Health Association in Australia, can you elaborate on this connection and with regard to the actual situation with Australian asylum seekers who want to come to Australia?
I think that what we've heard tonight is, well, it's devastating, but the emphasis has largely been on medical rather than health. So the World Health Organization in defining health doesn't talk about an absence of disease or injury and so forth. It actually talks about the ability to live reasonable lives under reasonable circumstances. And as such, it's quite clear that we as a society are denying to a group of people the right to be healthy. And I think that for me is a really difficult process. And it's really easy for us to point the finger at the government and say, well, look at these terrible things you're doing. And by the way, they are. But I think also we've got to wear some of the responsibilities ourselves, probably not that many people in this room. But Tony Abbott said right from the beginning he was going to stop the boats. He's still saying it, actually. And Australians voted for him. And voted for him pretty strongly, actually. Certainly the polling shows that many are devastated, but that's not because we put ourselves in the shoes of asylum seekers. It's because suddenly we can realise that he's taking the same sort of approach to Australians as he's taken to asylum seekers. So I think they actually really have to ask people to put themselves in the shoes of others and think about what we mean to live in a healthy community. And yes, we heard the medical things, but in amongst it was the whole notion of a lack of a healthy community. And I suppose it's just not enough to say it's incredibly irresponsible. It's quite devastating.
Thanks, Michael. Gillian, have you got anything that you'd like to add to that? Michael?
Well, I mean, I reiterate one of the points that Michael made, which I think that the issue of health is not a legal one in a strict black letter sense. The question of health is a social question. It's a question of enabling people to live in environments where they can get the best possible health outcomes available to the particular society they're in. In a country like Australia, an advanced Western country, the highest standards of healthcare ought to be available. And the Australian government is deliberately putting people in situations which it knows are deleterious to their health. It's doing it to a cohort of people which it knows are carrying with them, in many cases, large amounts of trauma and other forms of health problems associated with them being refugees. And it's doing this on the basis of a lie. It's saying that they're administratively processing them, when in fact what they're doing is punishing them and trying to deter others from seeking their rights under international law, and more broadly the moral rights which we ought to be obliged to share with them. And so I think the question of health goes to the core of what the government's doing, but it needs to be looked at in the context of being a social and political question.
And Michael, that social question, when we talk about health in Australia, we talk about housing, we talk about planning, we talk about education. These are all things about good health, and clearly on all these aspects we're failing miserably.
Okay, Anne Clark, we've worked in Papua New Guinea together for a long time. You went to Manos to work for the Salvation Army. Can you describe, and I'll just read Anne's biography. She's worked for development agencies in the area of health for many years. In 2013, she worked at the Manus Island Detention Centre, but she resigned her post there as she witnessed the poor conditions of detainees. So, Anne, can you describe the health of asylum seekers on Manus Island? And I know that you were in contact with some recently released detainees. Can you describe their ongoing health concerns, particularly those health issues that you think may have been exacerbated by their detention in Manus?
Thank you, and thank you very much, everybody, for speaking. I can't believe how nervous I am. I would really like to acknowledge the fact that I'm looking at different pieces of equipment because I'm on the road here, and I had the opportunity to contact a number of people in detention to ask what I may represent on their behalf. So these are not my words, and modern technology is an amazing thing. So I would like to, with your permission, to grapple with some of the technology which I thank this young man for sending me today. About medical in Manus and Nauru, and I would like to acknowledge the fact that he is only talking about medical health, and I was really surprised that they didn't acknowledge the broader range of health issues. About medical in Manus and Nauru, I can give you some examples, like the day they removed the healthy tooth instead of the infected one. Lots of people infected by malaria and suffered from humidity on the island. We were overdosed on Panadol and Panadine, diarrhea, constipation. The kitchen was very dirty. We found things in our meals and a lot of other problems. About mental issues, I can tell you I was witness to 4 or 5 suicides. Think why people would want to end their life. And then about 10 minutes later, I got another email. Hey Anne, there were lots of things that I forgot to talk about. We were in Manus. You might heard about the attack on the detention centre by local people. He forgot that I was there at the time. A fight between the military and the police of PNG beside the detention centre. You may have read about this when they took to each other with sticks, rocks and guns. At the time, Australian and all staff were evacuated to safe places while we were inside the fences and watching the staff going, but no one cared about us. It happened 4 or 5 times. You know, I felt worthless and unsafe we were there. We ask ourselves, where did we come and where are we seeking asylum? They care only about their staff, and at the time Scott Morrison commented on that incident that we evacuated all staff to a safe place, but no one asked about the asylum seekers. I just wanted to add this. Thanks. I would like to say he also rang me to tell me that my sister took him for a driving lesson this afternoon. I think it's almost pornographic to go along with the endless list of obscene consequences of people living in detention without acknowledging I'm sorry, I forgot the woman who welcomed us to country with an acknowledgement of health being the health as a measure of the health of the whole of the community. On Manus Island, you have also got many, many young people who are not trained to act in a health supporting role for these many young men in detention, in Manus particularly. So we have to ask ourselves what kind of society and what kind of community are we living in that we want our young people without training to go and learn to work with people without hope, who have no hope for the future and who attempt to take their own lives on a regular basis. and that it's not just the health of the asylum seekers, but the health of the young Australians that we're sending to work in those places and supposedly providing them with real work, which I think we should be equally ashamed of. I also prepared a comment that because Mark left early, I was supposed to respond to an accidental question about how response to the notice that more PNG staff would be used in the health centres within PNG, and I'd like to read what I prepared. I think the idea of including more PNG staff in the health centres on Manus Island will be very good for the PNG staff who work there. I think it will work very well for the PNG staff that get very well paid jobs on the Manus Island IHMS clinic. Compared to the average health post in PNG, it is a dream workplace. They will be paid. They will have a roof. They will have walls, water, power, medical supplies, and highly trained co-workers. However, it is shameful to consider that Australia has poured hundreds of millions, possibly billions, into developing PNG's health sector, and PNG's health statistics remain somewhere down on the charts with the Sudan and the Yemen and some of the places, worse than some of the places than people have fled from. That said, by engaging PNG staff whose training has been paid for with Australia's taxpayers' money through the Australian AusAid agencies and now DFAT to improve the health and well-being of the lives and communities of Papua New Guineans, for them to then turn and work in the offshore detention centres, in my opinion, is tantamount to stealing from the healthcare from the people of PNG. It is the worst form of boomerang aid. That said, well-paid detention centre jobs will merely deny the people of PNG attention from better qualified PNG health staff. For the asylum seekers, it will simply mean that they are at greater risk of not having the right tooth removed. It will mean that they are of greater risk of having a serious problem become fatal, or a simple problem, treatable problem, becoming fatal and more serious. Any medical condition treated as it would be, would not be treated, therefore, as it would have been by an Australian staff member used to taking power and water and medical supplies for granted in their workplace. They will not even be treated as well as they possibly would have been in either Iran or Iraq. And to hear people say that these people turn up with fancy dental work is really, really embarrassing. So, that said, I thought by noting that to steal from the people of Papua New Guinea makes this bad situation even more embarrassing. Thank you.
Mark Harris. Professor Mark Harris is the Professor of General Practice and Executive Director of the Centre for Primary Health Care and Equity at the University of New South Wales. He has substantial experience in health services, research and trials on chronic illness prevention and management in primary health care. His clinical practice is as a volunteer GP with the Asylum Seeker Centre from 2000 to the present, and he received a humanitarian award in health in 2010 from the Refugee Council of Australia in recognition for his work with asylum seekers. My question for you, Mark, is that you've worked for 14 years as a medical profession in the Asylum Seekers Centre in Sydney, with asylum seekers living in the community. Can you please comment on some of the health issues that you've seen in these asylum seekers living in the community, and does detention and offshore detention in particular compound the health problems that you see in your practice with community?
Okay, thank you. I feel very humbled to speak in this group and got great admiration for some of the people that have spoken out about what's happened in detention. My own experience is with asylum seekers in the community, and in terms of those include people who've arrived by plane and boat, and then have been subsequently released into the community on temporary protection visas. And when they're released on those visas without the ability to work, without the ability to find accommodation, and without access to healthcare, including Medicare and the pharmaceutical benefits scheme. So, and they also live in a state of prolonged uncertainty. They really don't know what's going to happen to them, and this can go on in several cases. This has gone on for up to 10 years. And so I think what I can add to what's been the considerable amount that's been said to date so far by saying that the problems that have occurred in detention certainly don't disappear when people are released. So we can't magically erase the problem by releasing people into the community. People who are released from detention suffer particularly from significant psychological problems. And those psychological problems obviously are related to their initial experience in their countries of origin, in the journey to Australia, but also in detention and also in living in the Australian community when, as I mentioned, they're living in a situation of considerable uncertainty and without resources. And this acts to compound the problem. And so we see continued trauma happening, and this is something which can't readily be fixed. It's something that there's groups of volunteer psychologists and psychiatrists and other healthcare workers working with in the community, and doctors like myself, and yet we're really not able to address some of the fundamental problems that they're confronting. From a public health point of view, we have to think about what we can do to prevent this. And clearly preventing it, the most obvious thing is to not put people in detention. But we also need to we need to change the dialogue in Australia from talking about boats to talking about the causes of refugees in the world and some of the trauma which refugees are experiencing and continue to experience. I've noticed that psychological problems have actually increased over the 14 years that I've been seeing people. They haven't diminished. They've been, and now probably 2/3 of the adult patients that I see are suffering from either severe depression, severe anxiety, or post-traumatic stress disorder. And that's not how it was when I first started seeing patients in 2000. That's all I've got to say.
Karen, as a community paediatrician, do you see refugee children and asylum seeker children in the community? Have you got anything to add to what Mark had to say?
I'll just say something a little more positive, and that is that the refugee populations that are coming to Australia by their very nature are a very resilient group of people, and they're often actually very skilled. The children that I see are highly motivated. They can teach most of our kids an enormous amount about motivation to learn, to improve themselves, to be generous, and to be very focused on achieving their goals. So, there's an enormous amount that we can learn and gain from welcoming people and not damaging them, because they actually arrive with a huge set of skills and learning opportunities for our local population.
Okay, so I've got one more general question for the entire panel. How can we change government opinion when it seems so intransigent on this issue? What can the average health professional or university student or citizen or permanent resident like me, I'm not a citizen, do to make the government, and I guess the Labor Party as well, take notice of what seems to me a growing groundswell of opposition to current policy and practice? And what can we do? We can stand up like John Paul has.
It was a really good start, wasn't it? Because in advocacy, and that's what I spend my life doing, we actually look for a groundswell, we look for getting groups together, we look to try and bring pressure on governments. But we also sometimes use some of the hard techniques, and I think the first one and the one that's most apparent now, and having been a health minister myself, is to look at Scott Morrison and say, actually, you failed in your duty. You knew months before, we know now from the Cornell report, he knew months before that was going to happen, and he did nothing. There were many steps he could have taken, and I think that it was it's really clear that he has failed in his responsibility as a minister. And I think we should be calling for him to stand down. Of course, they'll come up with another Scott Morrison. We've seen it before in the Labor Party as well. But that position, as long as either Labor or Liberal continue with these sorts of policies, that position should be as untenable as possible. So that's on the negative side. But the positive side, and that Karen just mentioned, is also really, really important. You know, I think about my own family and refugees. My mother came by boat during World War II as a ward bride. My great-great-great-grandfather, I think, was a horse thief in Ireland, and he came by boat. And you know, these people have actually made a huge contribution to our nation, and we look around at all the Vietnamese people who came by boat not so long ago, and the contribution that they and their children and their grandchildren make to our nation. These are people who actually have had the guts to say, no, I'm not going to stand this, and I'm going to move somewhere else. These are people with huge initiative, with huge drive. These are people actually we want in our community. Some of them are actually a little bit different than us. And actually that's something that in Australia we've learned to celebrate over the last little while, and I think we need to do it. But we have to actually get those messages out, and there's a series of ways. I'm just going to finish. There's a series of ways of doing that, and most of us now are tweeting. I've been tweeting tonight, and we actually have to use the social media to help change the attitudes as well. It's working very, very well about the Abbott hockey budget. Let's expand it and make these people feel really, really uncomfortable.
Thanks, Michael. Okay.
Thank you, Michael. I repeat this story every time I think of it when you've just said that, but I'd also like to introduce myself as a boat person. My parents spent a lot less than the amount of money that most asylum seekers spent to get here. I only came from South Africa, a lot less distance away. Anyway, I was watching a comedian called Sammy Shah, and my very favourite line from his is, "Doesn't Scott Morrison realise that these people who are coming are the good guys, the bad guys won?" Yes. Which always works well. But I have another really fabulous example of the resilience of the kind of people that many of these, mostly young people, are. There are some young men who have been released from Manus, and they represent a very confused policy black hole. People were sent to Manus, and after July 17, what I like to refer to as the Highland clearances were conducted, and they were spirited away plane load by plane load to make way for the post-July 17 people who were told they would never set foot in Australia. And in that mungle and bungle of botched efforts and relationships with PNG, who has no policy and no ability to carry it out, some people stayed longer and shorter, and there was confusion and mayhem, and resulting in all of the things that we have discussed. So some people spent up to 12 months living in Manus, in detention in various sizes of chicken coops, and some got sent back to Australia nearly 7 months ago at the first phase of the Highland clearances. And I was in Perth recently, and I was invited into their home to welcome them. One young man has been released from detention for 1 month after being in Manus and then Darwin, and his brother was released 7 months ago. One young man is shaking still, asking questions about his young wife and child who he has never seen. And the younger brother is asking me to make time to help him with a project that his cousin is doing, and could I speak to camera about a study he would like to do on Australian culture. I said, yes, could we do it as a sort of a talk fest? And he said, I said, I'll ask you a question, you ask me a question. So I said, yes. How would you like to describe Australian culture to your friends and relatives in other countries? And he said, Australia is the greatest place in the world. I can walk down any footpath on any street and I can be who I am without any fear. I looked at him and I was like, you're in community detention. And this is a young man, this is how he sees his hope. On the other side of the camera is the man, the brother who's still holding the camera. His hands are still shaking as a consequence of spending more than 14 months in detention. So it's not all gloom and doom, and I think I would really love to see a campaign by which we can demonstrate how fabulously these people have survived in spite of the vindictive nature of the policy.
I think there's two dynamics to being a refugee. One is that to some degree you're a victim of state oppression and so on, and the sort of treatment you get in countries like Australia when you try and seek entry here. And so, and it's one of the things that's come through tonight, is that there's a real sort of tendency to sort of emphasise the bad things that governments are doing to refugees, and there's an obvious reason to do that in Australia, because the Australian government by and large is doing bad things to refugees. But on the other hand, I think there's this sort of whole notion, as a couple of people have just mentioned, about refugees also being survivors of adversity and incredibly inventive and resilient in the face of what have been extraordinary circumstances. And it's that resilience and capacity to survive which actually enables people to get as far as the shores of Australia and hope that they can settle here. And I think that's a really important sort of dynamic to try and harness in terms of trying to restore in public debate the humanity of refugees. We're not talking about victims, just about victims. We're talking about people who can make a real contribution to society and who have done enormous things, courageous things already. I think in terms of campaigning, I've never been convinced that the mass of the Australian population wants to see children locked up on desert islands. I mean, I don't believe that. And if you look at the polling from the last election, the more extreme Labor's policies became, and the shift by Rudd when he first came in to introduce processing on PNG and so on, didn't count very much at all in the actual overall polling. And most of the polling, which was conducted throughout the campaign, suggested that for most people, refugees weren't a significant issue. Sure, there was sort of, an acknowledgement amongst particularly the coalition's heartland that they wanted to see a more harsh stop the boats type approach. But by and large, I don't believe that most people determined their vote in the last election on the basis of refugee policy. And I think that's really important, because I think when we start talking about the experiences that refugees have, that there's some capacity there to get a hearing. In terms of how to campaign, well, I suppose it depends a little bit where you are and your ability to do that. I'm a member of the NTEU, which is our staff union at the university. A group of us have started meeting the last couple of months to try and work out ways in which we might campaign within the union more generally to try and get a higher profile approach to this. One practical question is the provision of scholarships for people who are being denied entry into university because they're on bridging visas and so on. Now, there's obviously legal restrictions to that, but it's an issue that can be raised more directly amongst people who work in the sector, who want to see people get an education. We want to see the government give some meaning to its commitments to providing education as a right and so on. And so I think there are a whole range of things you can do depending on where you are to campaign. But I don't think campaigning's a dead end. I really think that campaigning works. And I think it did have a significant impact on the Howard government. The cycles turned to some degree, but I don't think there's any objective reason why it can't make a significant impact again in the medium term. Particularly, and I'll just wind up on this, I don't want to rant too long about this, but I mean, particularly I think what this is about is not so much the strength of the government, but its weakness. It's about the government trying to secure its own legitimacy by proving that it can do something, as it says it's going to do. It says it's going to stop the boats, whatever that might mean, but it will show that it's a source of legitimacy amongst its own heartland, and I think that's not the basis on which a government will remain stable. And I think they're vulnerable in a whole range of other reasons, and a whole range of other areas. And I think that it gives a space for the debates around refugees to revive, and I suspect when the Human Rights Commission eventually gets around to releasing its report on children, that it's likely to have the same quite devastating impact that the last report made in 2004, and I'm sure many of you will remember that, where Amanda Vanstone, who was then the minister, tried to bluff it out. She said, this is giving succor to smugglers to let children out of detention. And even within the coalition, there was a backbench revolt around this question, and eventually they were forced to relent. And so I don't think that it's an entirely bleak situation, although I acknowledge that the mainstream consensus amongst the sort of official political class is pretty dismal.
Okay, well, I'm going to have to draw this to an end. It's now your turn. You've been sitting very patiently for longer than we said we were going to keep you. It's your turn to ask questions. Could people go up to the microphone in the middle of the room to ask questions? It's in the middle aisle, just unless that's too difficult. Okay. Yes.
Hi. Thank you very much for
Can you just say who you are and where you're from?
Sure. So my name is Atsushi. I work in the private sector, working in public policy consulting. Thank you very much for a very informative evening. My question is very much a practical element, I suppose, around refugee policy. Putting aside, of course, the controversy around whether there truly is a budget crisis or not, the reality probably is that there is a finite amount of Australian government budget that can be allocated to different outcomes, I suppose, that the Australian people would like to see. Does the panel have thoughts as to how you might encourage perhaps a productive, constructive discussion that recognises, I suppose, the trade-offs between, if you want to spend money in one aspect of public policy, that may or may not leave some amount of money in another, for example, maybe healthcare or something like that. Do you have thoughts around that? I just think that currently a lot of the debate is very much about who raises the loudest voice.
Mine is a very lay response. At about $1 million a head to hold someone in Nauru in 2012 to 2013 with 300 young men, and you could sentence them all to study law or medicine, and you could solve the rural health crisis in Australia.
And pay their fees.
Or put them up in the Hyatt.
And you'd still have 500 grand left over per head to buy them a house and make sure they don't move to Sydney.
And how do you explain that to someone who's coming from a disadvantaged community in rural New South Wales or Far North Queensland?
Well, actually, we can share some of the money with them too.
Okay.
My understanding, I have a friend who's a rural member of parliament in Western Australia, and he said, if you tried to remove the Nigerian trained doctor from Kellerberrin or one of those unpronounceable places, the town would revolt and you would be lynched, which is not what we have been led to believe about the popularity of foreign trained doctors working in rural areas. I think it's a furphy to bother worrying about it.
Anything else? Anybody else? Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, could I just say that the Audit Commission, the recent report which declared the budget crisis, said, and I'm not sure the exact time frame here, I think it was the time frame of the current government, that what was being spent on offshore processing was in excess of $4 billion. I think that figure alone stands by itself. You don't need an argument, you just need an imagination about how that can be spent elsewhere.
That's apart from the actual border force, the new border force, and all the weapons and so forth that will go with that. It's a brilliant question, and don't forget that when we have people who actually want to work and who have great ideas and great skills, we really want them in our community making a contribution.
Your turn.
Thank you for a wonderful forum this evening. My name is Philip Feinstein from the Music for Refugees organisation in Australia. A few times this evening it came up about the stress that refugees have, and my question, perhaps Karen, it might be to you more than anyone else. At Nauru, at Christmas Island and Manus, I'm just wondering how much in the way of music instruments are there, because music is a wonderful reliever for stress, and the organisation I'm involved with knows this, because on the mainland we get lots of instruments for musicians, and would you believe that Serco have actually been very, very receptive to helping on this, but Transfield have not quite been as good on the offshore story. So I'm just wondering if any of you, Karen, if any of you know what the story is about music instruments offshore.
I don't know about Nauru and Manus because I haven't been there. Christmas Island, there were no musical programs of people playing instruments. They sometimes have music, discos for the kids and things like that. But no, I'm not aware of any formal programs. There's not a lot of those kind of therapeutic group interventions at a health promotion level. In other words, when you're well and you're able to really enjoy and participate and be creative. There's very little at that end of the health, the preventive health end of the services that are provided there. It's a great idea.
Yeah, I'm unaware of any sort of official programs, anything like that, or how many instruments are found around the place. But I do know that there was one Serco guard, a Maori, who had a guitar that he used to play often, and it was great. It was fantastic. He'd sit there while particularly kids from Bravo camp would come across, and yeah, just sort of entertain them while they're waiting. It did make a difference. Yep.
There were a few musical instruments on Manus, and a few young men used to gather in the mornings, which is not a good time to make use of a very limited number of musical instruments in a small space. And the young man who got together with another young man were the local staff to support that activity. But it was extremely limited number of musical instruments, and even fewer resources to enable that to be done in any therapeutic, educative, participatory or community activity spirited kind of way.
Thank you.
Hopefully we'll change that.
Yes.
My name's Virginia Walker. I'm from Bridge for Asylum Seekers Foundation. Some years ago, by introduction to my question, I was visiting Villawood Detention Centre, and amongst the people I was visiting was a Cambodian couple. He had been a journalist in Cambodia, and he had written against Hun Sen. And the editor of the newspaper was killed, and he fled, the fellow that I met, with his wife from Cambodia. And they were really worried about what Hun Sen would do to them if they were returned. And so they were eventually removed from Villawood, and they went to France, where they are now living safely. And their family have joined them there. Why on earth are we sending anybody to Cambodia from Manus and from Nauru? It is an utter disgrace. And I just wish that we could do something to stop it, because there's no infrastructure. There's no proper health care. The human rights are appalling, and Hun Sen is still in power. What are we going to do? It is shameful. Has anybody got any idea about what we can do? Because it is a terrible situation. It's up to you.
I think that was a bit rhetorical in some senses, wasn't it? But yes, you're right.
Actually, you know, each and every one of us should actually write to our local member. You know, these days, local members don't get very many letters on paper with one of these things, and they do. Well, I actually still got a fountain pen actually, but biros work as well on paper. Really, when a member of parliament gets 4 or 5 letters, provided they're not, you know, almost similar in format or effectively copies, they get 4 or 5 letters, they actually start to think, hell, what's going on here? When they get 15, they think, oh, 15 people are actually prepared to write, not just flash an email, that it has an impact. And we really should be doing that to our local members.
Thank you.
Can write to Julie Bishop as well. She's the one negotiating it.
Julie Bishop's my local member.
I'm really sorry, but after this next question, I'm actually going to have to stop because we're going to get kicked out of the building quite soon. If you've got any questions, you're welcome to come and see the panel members as we disperse, but we can't, we've just got to move on because I'm going to get into big trouble with the university. So, you're lucky last.
Thank you. Thanks for a great panel. I'm Kate Orbison. I'm from Australian Doctor magazine. This question predominantly goes to Dr. Sangaran and Dr. Clark, but everyone. We see recently that there have been another sort of round of vacancies opening up on onshore and offshore detention centres. What do you say to doctors who are considering taking up these positions?
Consider your registration.
Do you fear for your registration?
Not now, but I think if you are part of that system, then you must take responsibility for it in some way.
Sorry, I'm not a medical doctor. I was there as a human being with a PhD, which didn't serve me very well. But as I say, the reason why I left, I think anyone who stays and works in those places has to consider in some way, unless they do complain and they do write to their MPs and they do write to everybody they think they can, and I have done, to remain in some way is to be complicit. And that has to be weighed up against your moral duty to the well-being and support of the people in a difficult situation. My ability to stay and do that was compromised, and my ability to do something here in Australia is better. So I'm better off here than there. There are other better people than me who are here this evening who are still there.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, to finish the evening off, can we have, I'm just going to read out a declaration. You've all got a copy of it on the back of your program, but I'm just going to read it out, and I would like to, if you agree with it, if you could sign it at the bottom with your name and address, and then we will collect them, and we'll collect more of them as we go along through social media, and we will be delivering this to the government. Okay, so this is a declaration by the Public Health Association of Australia and the School of Public Health and Community Medicine at the University of New South Wales. Declaration on Public Health, Human Rights and Asylum Seekers. We, the undersigned, recalling the universal, interdependent and indivisible nature of human rights, including the right to seek asylum as outlined in the 1951 Convention, Refugee Convention, the right to health as outlined in the International Covenant of Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, and foregrounded in the Constitution of the World Health Organization, as well as those outlined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Recognising that an asylum seeker, by fleeing persecution in their homeland and in attempting to arrive in Australia, is exercising their right under international law to apply for asylum, and that returning them to places with questionable human rights records places them at further risk. Noting that Australia benefits enormously from the economic, social and cultural contribution that asylum seekers, most of whom are found to be genuine refugees, ultimately make to our society. Express concern that asylum seekers, including children, continue to be held in offshore detention. We note that extensive scientific research tells us that asylum seekers in detention have significant health problems, and the longer people are detained, the poorer their health outcomes, both mental and physical. The impact of detention on children is more severe. People seeking asylum are at risk of mental health problems based on specific risk factors, including loss and trauma, both prior to and following arrival. The experience of extended periods of immigration detention means that detainees suffer an ongoing sense of insecurity and long-term psychological harm, including difficulties with relationships, depression and demoralisation, concentration and memory disturbances, and persistent anxiety, sometimes leading to suicide or intentional self-harm, and call on the Australian Government to end offshore detention and processing of asylum seekers and process all asylum seekers in Australia. Ensure asylum seekers have access to health services, social security, legal representation, interpreters, case management, paid work, and appropriate education for the duration of their assessment. Ensure that initial health assessments of asylum seekers be conducted with care and dignity, and in all healthcare in the period of assessment is of the highest standard, and end extended periods of detention, as they greatly add to the physical and mental health problems of asylum seekers, and to avoid detention of all children. Okay, so those of you that support this declaration, can you sign it with your address and name and address on the bottom of it, and somebody from our school will collect it as you go out. I want to thank you all very, very much for attending, and I'm sorry it went on a little longer than we expected, but it was, I think, a very, very good day. I really, really want to send my absolute thanks to all the panel members and the keynote speakers, and we hope to have some more outcomes from this in terms of a special issue or a part special issue of a journal. We'll keep you all informed. We've got your emails, so we can tell you if something's going to come out, and we'll tell you what the outcomes are of signing the declaration. Thank you very much. Well done, Heather.
So Heather is just giving some gifts to our speakers. I'd like to thank the speakers very much. I wish there's a lot more that could have been said and people had other questions, but thank you very much. And there's two special thanks tonight. One is to Professor Heather Worth. Heather, come up here and receive some flowers. And the other is Christina Rofe. Where are you, Christina?
Oh, yeah.
Christina's been organising all of this behind the scenes, and she's worked tirelessly. There's a whole team of people as well who are on the working group to put it together, so thank you to all of them. I think Jed Horner, Anita Haywood, Sally Nathan, Heather, do you want to name the other people on the working group?
Well, we've had all the administrators, Anthony, Christine Rosellis, and the committee members. Thank you all extremely, very, very much. And yes, can we have a round of applause for the panel?
Thank you to Christine, and thank you to the Public Health Association of Australia.
Yes.
And Michael.
Yeah.